It's, I can't tell whether it's rain or snow. It's a kind of great in-between that we have. It's good to have Steve Cassell here of ARO. Many of you have met Stephen. Some of you are his students. Steve Cassell and Adam Yarinsky started Architectural Research Office in the mid-1990s. And you may be familiar with one of their projects on Times Square, which is down in the exhibition below us. And that was the Visitor Center for USO. The USO, not, you know, we don't generally associate the government or the military with much of a sense of humor. So it was actually great to find this pavilion on Times Square, which is all about advertising and billboards, using a kind of strategy that takes the notion of billboard and turns it on its ear. So you get inklings of Jasper John's American flag, but clearly rereadings of Dan Flavin and his very powerful minimalist work depicting the American flag. And so the pavilion itself becomes a super graphic representation of America in the midst of the cacophony, which is Times Square, which is no mean feat. Since that project, which was begun in 1998 and completed in 1999, so just about 10 years ago, ARO has worked at the scale of interiors and new buildings, and they've won commissions through a number of competitions, both of these as yet unbuilt. And now with the current economy, one can only hope for something counterintuitive. One of these was for a performing arts center in Weston, Connecticut, and the other was for the Motown Museum in Detroit, which was one in a project that was submitted collaboratively between ARO and David Rockwell, and had the kind of unique distinction of having on the jury a number of architects, but also Smokey Robinson and Berry Gordy, which is probably the only time you'll have Smokey Robinson selecting your architecture. They've also worked on interiors at Columbia University. They're working on the renovation of the Avery Library. They've also worked at Brown on the renovation of a student center and library facility. Also with a kind of sense of humor, describing, rather than saying quiet, they just have signs that state the decibel level for certain areas, given the numbers, which is a kind of clever way of telegraphing to people that this is a place for quiet or for conversation. They've also completed the renovation of the School of Architecture at Princeton, certainly one of the most confusing small buildings on an American campus, especially post multiple all-nighters. And both Stephen and Adam know this firsthand. Stephen was an undergraduate at Princeton, and Adam was a graduate student there. They're currently working on transforming a sector of Union Square Park, working with Michael Van Valkenburg for a new restaurant pavilion in what used to be an open-air pavilion at the northern end of the park. Many of you have seen this in your stroll through the city. That whole part of Union Square has been torn up for some time, and the project is finally going forward with some hitches, I guess, for permitting. In addition, they're working on the renovation of another iconic building in Lower Manhattan, and that's the studio building for Donald Judd. So we see art and architecture coming full circle. Their work has a clarity in its material use, and they attend to program as a way of generating the complexity, not of the forms, but of the uses that, that this can sponsor. Recently, they've completed a project in East New York for a series of affordable housing units There was a collective of architects which included Della Valle and Bernheimer and Laura Briggs. And this complex of buildings makes reference to the building type of 3- and 4-story homes in that part of Brooklyn. And while using very, very different materials, they managed to respond to the scale and the kind of resonance of neighborhood that's found there. They were a natural selection for the competition that the school is involved in now from the ground up. And they'll be working again with Della Valle Bernheimer. Many of the second-year students met on the West Side and helped to tour the 7 finalist teams. And I know that Stephen got a good tour with our students who helped kind of unpack what that neighborhood was about. ARO has taught at numerous schools besides Syracuse, including U.VA, Harvard, Princeton, RISD, and Tulane, to mention a few. They have research awards that date from early on in their firm's life, from the Young Architects Award in 1996 at the Architectural League. They've since then gotten research awards from the New York State Council on the Arts, as well as New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship. The work of the firm has garnered numerous AIA awards, as well as an American Architecture Award from the Chicago Athenaeum, the Chrysler Design Innovative Award, but perhaps most uniquely, they were the winners for the City of the Future competition, which was a multi-city project sponsored by the Discovery Channel, and that was for the New York 2016. Their work has been published extensively here and abroad, from the New York Times to ID, to A+U, GQ, and Casabella. They've exhibited extensively, and we'll all have a chance to see some of that work immediately following the lecture. I welcome you all to that reception, and it's a great pleasure to introduce Steve Cassell. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I feel like I don't have to show anything after that introduction. Probably be better in your imagination. I sort of wanted, Mark described what we're working on right now, and we're sort of at this point in our office where, and as I was putting together this lecture, we're doing a pretty wide variety of work, maybe an odd variety, I'm not quite sure. So some we're starting to do more and more institutional and academic work. We're in the middle of design development for a Rare Books Library for NYU Institute of Fine Arts. We're collaborating with Jamie Carpenter on this. And then the Union Square project, which is really the renovation of the north end of Union Square, and part of it an underground building and rebuilding the existing building. And whoops, well, there were supposed to be lots of little words in there. I obviously copied and pasted the wrong thing, but we're just finishing the research phase for a planning study right below the World Trade Center site down to Battery Park. So we're right in the middle of sort of trying to sort of set up the planning priorities for that neighborhood. And a lot of our work always starts with sort of a heavy research phase. Obviously, that's in our name. And then the Judd Foundation, which were in construction documents, sort of rebuilding Donald Judd's residence, which is still a single-family residence. Actually, really amazing. You can't get in there right now. It's violating major fire codes, but when it's done, it will look exactly like this, and really amazing. Like Marfa, except vertical instead of horizontal. Each floor is really sort of walking into someone's brain and how they think, and it's actually a real honor to work on the project because you're learning so much. We are also an office that does a lot of work with material research, some stuff with CAD/CAM. This is some studies for a series of screens that we did for an apartment up on the Upper West Side. These are MDF milled screens. And also sometimes just internal projects. This is a laser cut corrugated cardboard lamp that really started out from an idea from an exhibition that we started to install, and really had the ultimate goal of just getting a light for my dining room table and fulfilling a promise to my wife to finally build a light. But a lot of these research things will have a person working on it on and off for 6 months or a year just in their spare time between projects, who are able to devote some time. That's a image of that light. In this, it's really a question of how can you transform an everyday material through the use of technology. Well, I'm just going to show you a variety of projects, a bunch of them which I haven't shown in lecture before, so it's always bumpy the first time. I apologize. And also some of them, this one, we're right in the middle of working on it, so it's partially finished. This is a project that we're collaborating with Guy Nordenson, a structural engineer, and he's actually leading the team. This is from a Latrobe Fellowship from the American Institute of Architects. What we're doing is studying the upper greater New York Harbor. And I actually wanted to, this project actually really started from that history, City of the Future competition. And in that competition, you know, you design City of the Future in a week. It's the ideal competition. I recommend it all. 1 week competition, you can only do so much damage. And in that, we were positing what would happen with global warming and the rise in sea levels. And of course, we made everything up because, you know, what can you really research in a week? And in working with Guy, we thought it was actually an interesting problem that we could seriously engage, and actually spent roughly the first year doing analysis of the greater upper New York Harbor. The Verrazano Bridge is down here, Manhattan is here, Governor's Island. And that research was doing sort of complete bathymetric model of the area, sort of the depth of the water, and understanding that. This is the Z dimension is magnified 10 times in scale to sort of understand the change in dimensions. And then starting to work with GIS mapping and trying to understand some of the physical characteristics. And in that, one of the things that we were looking at, this is called a slosh study. Like sea, land, and I can't remember the rest. But in essence, it's a mapping to show the penetration of water in major hurricane or major flooding events. And one of the clear things, there's several issues that's going on within with the global warming. Obviously, there's projected a 6-inch to 24-inch rise in sea level, I think, to 2030 is projected, with a possibility of going up around 3 feet in 2080. The other part of that, however, is a change in the frequency of hurricanes and how hurricanes affect the area. So, and I'm sure there's actually real subtlety in how you say this. We've been working with a geophysicist from Princeton. Part of the team is at Princeton University, and Guy is both in practice as an engineer and teaches at Princeton. That what would normally be a 100-year hurricane, basically what's the worst hurricane that would happen in 100 years, now you can expect in 19 to 60 years. So a rare event, a 500-year hurricane, now you could expect in 100 years. And what that really means is the possibility of raise in water levels of up to 24 feet. And you can see, actually, there's I live in Brooklyn, pretty deep in Brooklyn, right there, actually. But you can see now the mayor's office is releasing maps and flooding maps. And so we started to focus on some of these issues, at the same time looking at the greater New York Harbor, trying to look at it in, and I'm going to just jump forward for a second, look at it in a different way. And so can you take an area that's really defined in New York and New Jersey and start to reestablish it as a sense of a place, and using analogy really as a modern version of Central Park. So at the same time dealing with these major issues and ecological issues, can you start to reframe how you see the harbor? Now, one of the ways that you deal with the storm surge is either with a hard, basically at these points, basically closing everything up in terms of a storm. One thing that we've been doing is trying to see, is there a soft way of dealing with that? Is there different strategies they can look at? And I'm going to actually, this is something we've been working on almost 2 years now, and I'm going to show you like one zoomed in part of that. because we're still working on the overall framework. And so on the one hand, can you reframe it so it becomes a place, and can you think of it as a place, and what does that mean? And we're actually proposing a relatively radical intervention in New York Harbor in three areas. One, creating a series of archipelagos that in essence, one of the issues we want to deal with is there's a major amount of force from a storm surge, so there's ways to absorb that force. The other way is basically to deal with softening the coastal edge, so rather than hardening the edge, and though in some places there are already bulkheads and a hardened edge to the water, can you make a softened edge that basically absorbs the energy from a storm and also starts to reestablish some of the sort of natural habitats and makes it occupiable in some ways. And then a third way, which we're working through, is then that also implies almost a democratic zoning of how do you occupy and start to deal with this. Parallel to that, we've been working with a team that's been doing modeling. So as we start to do proposals, they basically run those proposals through a sort of computational fluid dynamics model to see, does it really work or not? What we've learned is that we crash the computer a fair amount. And parallel, we've ended up doing models of the whole site, and then doing abstract models of specific conditions of dealing with that. And then also, we're just starting to work on the other side of just doing old-fashioned physical water table models. And if you see a lot of the Army Corps of Engineers, we're in the middle of building the water table. I'll also show you a cool slide about that. And sure to leak onto our table saw and make a mess in our shop. To see just using water table and dye and sand to see if you can start to model these both in the computer and physically. And we realize that in some ways this is clearly a conceptual study, and so however, can you start to work with some basis of feedback as you start to work through it. What I was going to show you tonight is just where we are right now in dealing with one area. We were focusing on the tip of Manhattan and really a series of strategies along that tip, and not surprisingly close to our other site that we're working on. And basically saying, how can you start to apply some of the strategies of defining the edge along Manhattan? And physically, how are you going to build that? I'm going to talk a little bit about, there's actually some cool, very interesting structures that Army Corps of Engineers is using for building up structures, and also working with, there's a lot of research on what to do with dredging from the channels. New York Harbor, there's a fair amount of dredging that's going on as the larger and larger ships are there, and there's been a lot of discussion of what to do with the material that's been dredged. So different strategies for dealing with the edge. And then starting to, in a partially fantastical way, obviously, work our way and start to define different zones as you move around the tip of Manhattan. And really starting to look just at sectional strategies as you deal with that. And so there's always sort of the existing and then the softening. So one strategy is basically a softening of the edge and berming with these geotubes that I'll show you in a minute. Or basically a feathering out of the landscape. This is, again, as you move around the tip, feathering out of the landscape and, again, making more occupiable. Different strategies for placing elements that float within the water to absorb the energy of the storm and also start to become natural habitats. And some more of the same. These are a more linear series. And we're basically trying to create sort of a system or kit of parts that we can then run through and test and model. Those are some of those elements. And other sort of programmatic uses of these storm surge barriers. And again, as you work through, this is down by the FDR on the east side of the island. And then also making a proposal to actually pull pretty deep into the island in one or two places. And feathering it, and leaving the FDR where it is, and then you always have to have the Hollywood effects that go with that. Of course, after Ji Jung in our office, who did this, we then realized we just grab screen grabs from what is it, the I can't remember. There's one movie, which, of course, as I was walking out of the office, he had them all pinned up. It's like, I did all this work for nothing. It shows New York being swamped. The other aspect that we're dealing with right now is also looking at these archipelagos and the islands themselves and looking at different ways of building them. And one of the, what seems the most promising method is to use a material that's basically called a geotube. It's a synthetic tube that gets, basically you pump liquid and landfill or fill into it, and basically water will go out and squeeze out of it. Basically like making a sausage, but a gigantic sausage. And these are used around the world. I even have the advertisements for it. But it's actually a pretty interesting technology that they're starting to use in a fair number of applications. And we were looking at a variety of methods. This seems the most doable. And what you start to look at are how do you start to define these and how do you start to program them? You know, what are they? Are they occupiable or not? I actually don't have an answer for you because it's what we're trying to work through right now. And also trying to look at formally what are they, and can you start to think of them of something that transforms over time as the current of the river and the tides start to link together. And so are there specific shapes that will allow for a transformation and making a larger landmass? And that's some of the stuff that we're doing with the sort of water table studies, because in looking at modeling that in the computer, it's far more power than we can get on a computer to study that. So these are some studies of that. And then some engagement of one or two of these different versions that literally we're in the process, sort of iterative process of working this through over the next 2 or 3 months. And then sort of putting it back into the computer models to see if it has the effect in terms of the power of the storm surge. So from really large scale, but staying on the water, to small project, our house we did in Martha's Vineyard. This is on a site that basically drops down to the water. It's a really beautiful site. It's sort of very low scrub oaks that pull their way up from the ocean. And it's sort of a sliver of land. The clients bought this like 40 years ago as a summer house, and now are moving out there to retire. And the house is just a simple series of 3 volumes that interlock and engage you as you move forward through the house. Within this area, there's a very strict zoning in terms of what material you can build and the height you can build at. And also, given the limited budget of the project, a lot of what we do is look at ways of engaging construction. In this case, engaging construction is like very typical construction for the island, and that because everything's shipped out there and because there's a limited pool of contractors, that you need to look at how people can build in the everyday, and then can you work from that and transform it. And what we built the house out of is just a simple cedar siding. The cedar is milled to different depths, and then it's basically oiled, so it bleaches. Most siding eventually bleaches out there. And that different depth is designed so over the course of the day, as the shadow and sun shifts, the depth and thickness of the wall and the reading starts to change. And so very, very low tech. So can we take that vernacular of construction out there, work within that language, and then transform it and materially transform it? In some ways similar to the corrugated cardboard lamp that I was showing you. So this is just the end of construction coming up to the house. The house is basically made mostly of the cedar siding and then zinc panels. There's an exterior courtyard as you walk in. We worked in collaboration with Michael Boucher, a landscape architect who practices out of Maine. So an exterior courtyard. And the client, interesting client, I guess it sounds like the beginning of a joke, because it's a rabbi and a print curator. One who was rabbi just wanted his place they're retiring their place to garden, and the prince curator, she's a curator at the Cooper Hewitt and has like a very, very precise sense of how the world and space should be ordered. Sort of an odd couple in terms of architecture. And then as you pull around through the house, and we worked hard to pull it as you pulled into the exterior courtyard, that you were almost back outside to start to negotiate the water beyond. And some views of how that comes together. Views of the interior. The interior and exterior materials, basically the siding comes into the house. And as does the zinc panels. You can see some of the zinc paneling here, and the sort of edge detail of zinc at the end of the wood walls. And this is a view to sort of glimpse through the kitchen. You can tell the house wasn't furnished when we photographed it. That's always the telltale sign. And then the water side. And down from the water. One of the odd things of working on these institutional projects, and we're an office that with doing these competitions and trying to get these larger buildings built parallel to doing the classic, slightly larger each project in terms of universities and institutions. One of which we completed around a year ago is an addition to the School of Architecture at Princeton University. It's always a slightly odd to, I guess Jim Garrison knows this, to work on, I'm assuming he's a graduate here, knows this, to work on a school where you went to school. And in this case, this and the next project are almost make a complete normal architecture project. This is a project that the School of Architecture is located on campus by Main Walk. It's really a classic School of Architecture of like the 1963 banal building that's very rigorous in its banality. Like many schools, really this whole purpose, the original purpose of the project is to make it ADA accessible and make sure they can get reaccredited. And at the same time, can you leverage that into a real addition for the building? Yes. So it's a disease that strikes everywhere, I guess, Mark. And so on the one hand, it's a very modest project, almost no program in some ways. Can you get you upstairs or not? And the other hand, are there just simple ways that you can use this program to sort of shift the school? One of the interesting things about Princeton, which I don't know whether it's always a reflection of the ideas behind the school or the architecture shaping the school, but Princeton has a clear sort of, there's the academic and faculty offices to one side, and then the students are separated in a separate building. And there's sort of this odd schism between the two. And one opportunity that we saw just very simply is can you just, through doing a small sort of razor sharp addition right at the center, can you sort of recenter the school so this becomes the center rather than you're always in studio or you're with the students? So can you make just a slight adjustment as you do this and conceptually change how a building is used? All our projects, we work in an iterative process, and we always try 5, 10, 15, 20 different versions as we work. Sort of an example, the main entrance of the school used to be right here, and so basically shifting over to the center. The one other thing that happens, there's actually a beautiful garden that I always suspected they tried to keep students out of so they wouldn't be smoking cigarettes and dirtying it up, because the president's original president's house is on the other side. But there's Princeton has an amazing landscape, and there's a beautiful landscape here. So again, can the building at least start to engage the landscape or help the building engage the landscape, even though it's sort of a modest addition? And you can see the before and after in terms of that. And are there ways, just very simply, to start to work within the rhythm and proportions? And it is the existing building, while maybe slightly banal, has an incredible rigor to it in terms of its form and proportion. And so can you weave your way into that, even though we were inherently working in a different material in glass and fritting, but can you tie into it sort of very rigorously within that rhythm? And the unfolded elevations of the building. The building is basically a fritted glass that's built around some of the existing structure that we had to keep, sort of an existing walkway. You should see that right there. that we kept in order to keep the school working during construction. And some views of the completed building. It really simply is just a stair, elevator core, and a small lounge that we added on top in the building at night. The stair basically pulls away from the elevator core. It's a simple folded plate steel. And then the glass basically has a variety of a fritting pattern, almost like actually very much like your suit, in a very good way, of course. Could you stand up, please? It basically has a fritted pattern that starts to tie into the rhythm of the existing bays on the structure. So basically pulling that language across from one volume and the transparency around and just trying to wrap and weave the new building into the existing building. And then a couple views from what was really the old center and sort of pulling over into the new addition. And they did get a lounge. Students got a lounge out of it. The building is actually called the Hyphen now. The students have named it last year when they moved in. And one of the things that, as I said, we tried to do is have it so you start to engage the landscape, even ever so slightly as you use the school, which really was a building that was very inwardly focused as opposed to externally. So as you go down the stairs and sort of the views outside, and from the outside, sort of engaging the trees beyond. And finally, the rear elevation at night. The opposite side of this project, parallel to it, so that was a project with almost no program and all architecture. This is a project with almost no architecture and all program. Yeah, it was sort of odd having the two in the office. This is a 24-hour study center we did at Brown University, where we're in the unfortunate position of seeming to get these commissions that are dealing with troublesome 1960s buildings. I don't know if that's a good thing or a really bad bad thing, but it's an interesting problem. This is basically dealing with a 1969 science library tower. I'm almost proud. We probably built 3 walls in this project in the end. And a lot of this project ties back to some of our earlier projects when we started our office of how do you leverage very little money in an intelligent way. This is basically taking the bottom of the tower and repurposing it as a 24-hour study center. The rest of the tower is a science library. The bulk of the project was actually underground with a series of 4 courtyards. It is a really tough-ass building that sort of had hints of beauty in it, like a lot of these buildings where it actually had a rigor and a clarity to it. And you can, when you look at the old drawings, you see where it was value engineered in the last 3 steps of construction. Pretty much all of our projects, then it's trying to look at how is this project going to be used and what is it. On one hand, it's a 24-hour study center. The other hand, it was starting to deal with how do you integrate that study center in a working science library that was a separate program and keep the two working well together, and working through the different aspects of how that program works, how people move through it, and how the students engage that. And a lot of that also dealt with talking to the university and the students and trying to see how can you get this project to align with Brown University's institutional mission and their sort of new sort of stated institutional goals of really pushing cross-disciplinary study throughout the sort of 4-year undergraduate process, and how can they push that forward. And part of it's also just doing old-fashioned sun study analysis. Does sunlight get down to that underground space, and where is it? And trying to treat it like a large site and learn the subtleties of how you understand it, the subtleties of how the program gradates in terms of the louder aspects of the program to the quieter, and the subtleties of how you move through the building. This is an axonometric of the main floor. You can see the 4 courtyards right here. And in essence, what we did is really gradate the programming in the study center from the loudest and collaborative areas to one side, just to the quieter individual study areas to the other. Just a really simple idea, and then trying to create different, almost microclimates for studying, as much difference as possible. The other aspect of this project was really trying to carve out aspects of the project, knowing where the architecture will go farthest. In this case, we thought it wasn't the architecture, it was the landscape architecture. So there was no budget for lighting or landscape architecture. We ended up cutting our program and getting their program to work in a smaller area to get Michael van Valkenburg, the landscape architect, to start designing the courtyards, because we felt pretty strongly that if the courtyards are beautiful, that you'll start to have a much better experience than anything we could do with the architecture. And then trying to break up the spaces in some clear ways, either collaborating with Michael in terms of the formal language that pulls through the courtyards, or creating little areas. This is the tanning room that gets the most sun in the area, to sort of the collaborative study rooms at the other side. Michael's courtyards, which aren't grown out in these photos, but are really designed around how the sun hits the courtyards and actually shaping them from evergreen to seasonal plants. They're actually quite really beautiful. To just simply trying to take the existing architecture and pull out what's beautiful, or what we thought was beautiful there. The collaborative study rooms just have a translucent glass, so as you're right, they can use as a whiteboard. You can see back on there, there's actually a great skylights that were in there. They were all hidden by books. We worked with Scott Stoll of Open, a graphic designer, who's a great office, to just create a series of typography through the space, and then started to code the space. And talking with the students, there's basically, once you set, and they were pretty clear about this, and they have this in other libraries, once you have these rules of where you can talk and where you can't talk, they're pretty strict about that. So this is the louder chatting area. It's right next to the People magazine stop, as they called it. Or is it moving back into the space? And really, it's almost all furniture except for the central space, which is basically taking some of the garden elements through with translucent resin panels, help divide up the space. And then the individual study at the other end, some great board form concrete. Again, there was all these elements that were hidden in its original use, so a lot of what we were doing was removing aspects that were there. And then also working with Scott, coming up with a series of elements that were silk screened throughout the project. Scott and some other people from his office basically went to all the different libraries and started to grab different images. Each one had a reference number to the library system. And those were silk screened and placed around 100 or 150 of them throughout the project. And so the sort of sense of collaboration that you're setting up and sense of discovery that people can start to look is up. There's some great ones, from the wall to, this is out one of the courtyards that references a poem on clouds, to actually this one, which you can barely tell, this is one of the stalls in the bathrooms that references a treatise on solitude. And really, in the case of this project, it's important to understand where architecture can be effective and where sort of strategy of graphics or strategy of ideas can be effective in creating a space. Mark mentioned a competition that we won, I don't know, maybe 4 years ago, for a performing arts center in Weston, Connecticut. This was an interesting site. This is basically a large middle school and high school on the other side. They have a really active performing arts. This is a public school, really large performing arts program. And at the same time, it's a very small town with no public buildings except a small library. And so they came up with an idea of creating a performing arts center that both double functioned as almost the civic center of the town for large exhibitions or performances, and then also tied in to the existing building and their existing classrooms as really part of the high school. And we conceived of the project really pretty simply as a simple theater that basically has a wrapper around it that negotiates both the program of the public program on one side and the sort of smaller scale school on the other, and also negotiates a relatively large change in topography from one side to another. This is the playing fields off to one side are raised up around 14 feet. One other aspect, just to jump back, the site actually was right here. We pushed the building over. There's an existing swimming pool here that has a lot of large windows that were closed off, I think in the 70s when they were leaking. And so one of the first things we did is move the building over to engage the berm and create more of a public space, an outdoor performance center, and start to create, the town uses the pool also to start to create more of a public plaza with some of these public programs that were already de facto used as the public. And in some ways, it's basically a very simple program that's then traced out through its two different uses. From the school, coming out from the low school, all the theater classrooms are basically right here. Then you basically can come out and go into a circulation system for the students. They have this for assembly also. So the act of moving through the building also allows you to see into the different aspects of the theater, down into the shop, and almost becomes a didactic tool about theater. While coming from the town, basically a sort of a larger, more public lobby that starts to engage the plaza and just moving into the theater itself. In the section, basically from the school side and the public side. And then the theater itself, the wrapper sort of pulling up to allow the theater to be exposed. But coming around from the town side, you basically slide under the wrapper, or from the public plaza. Very subtly coded red for theater. It was always important in competitions to make things very clear. And then also the exterior plaza right here, the pool's right there. And then the student circulation, who actually brings you between the theater on a series of catwalks that brings you around, or dropping down from the school down into the main spaces, or dropping down into the shops beyond. Looking back from the school. And then the theater itself, which is just conceived as simple stained plywood panels. And then finally, a view from the pool, and starting to reconceive of this whole area as a public plaza, and really sort of the center of the town. One project that we completed, this is probably an older project we completed, is a store that we did for Kiora, basically Shiseido. And so we've always done some commercial projects in our office with the institutional, and try to work between the two. And in some ways, in engaging these, is trying to align the conceptual direction, whether it's of a university or a school system or a theater, or in this case, cosmetics. And we always look for clients who have a really clear point of view of what the goals of their projects are, not a point of view in what the architecture needs to be, but what the architecture needs to do. In this case, he was a great client, basically the art director for Shiseido, this new cosmetic line, came and had these designs for this new packaging that I thought was quite beautiful, and it was basically designed so as they sat on the shelves irregularly, it started to create almost a forest of products. And they wanted to create, rather than creating a big advertising campaign for this line, they wanted to create basically a store that became an emblem for that, and create a spa that goes around that starts to become an icon for Shiseido. Of course, in retrospect, I don't know if that was a good idea, since Kiora doesn't exist anymore. But it was a great idea as an architecture, and as an architect coming in with such a clear sort of formal language that they had set up. We, again, in every project, always start through both model and drawings. Of the first couple of weeks of a project, we do 5 or 10 projects, and then we throw it out, and then we start working as a way to start intuitively engaging a problem. Then we usually pull back and start to analyze. Use a series of models. Once in a while, when you do that, you actually stumble upon a good idea that you can keep working with. In this case, we did, and we started to conceive of the store almost as this glowing icon related to the formal language of the packaging. But defined in a way, this is basically a store in the front. This is on Madison Avenue. It's a 20-foot high space. store in the front and a series of spas in the back and sort of a programmatic spine along one side. We conceived of the store basically wrapping all the walls in fluorescent lights and then draping fabric in front of it. This is some of the mock-ups that we were doing as we were designing. And in this case, we were collaborating with two people. One, a firm called Johnson Swinghammer, which is a lighting designer, and Mary Bright, who unfortunately passed away a couple years ago, but was really one of the few people who understand modernism and fabric and really sort of engage that. And as we were working to a certain point, we realized this is a Mary project where you start to work around this idea of materiality and fabric. And so this is a view from Madison Avenue. And in essence, what we did is create a series of organza fabric strips that hang from the ceiling. And then the same fabric lines the walls, but a white fabric lining the walls, masking basically several hundred fluorescent lights. The lights themselves, as they're on the wall, actually there's warm fluorescent lights and cool fluorescent lights. So and they're hooked up to a electronics dimming system. So over the course of half an hour to 40 minutes, they slowly shift from warm light to cool light. And they sort of shift back and forth, again, trying to create almost a subtle new environment for the product. And you can see the cabins beyond, and then the individual products on tables, each one having a little fiber optic line that illuminates them. And that fiber optic also changes at night to a different type of lighting. So in this project, we were really trying to create an abstract light, sort of language of light and form, creating a new, sort of new context for that. This is one of the nice things about working on a wide variety of projects is you start to learn learn all these odd things. And now I know all about specific ways of putting on makeup and oily T-zones, and in the same way that I know obscure references from Brown University's library. It's one of the things you always have to love. Some of the fabric product in the walls. And finally, the last project I'm going to show you is another competition. I put this in here because it was actually exactly 4 years ago we did this competition. This was an invited competition for a Vietnam Veterans Education Center by the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. And we were one of 4 people competing for this project. And it was one of these things where it's as important the physical context of a project as the conceptual context. We started this project in April, and the basically goal of the project was to create an education center for the Vietnam Memorial. And in some ways, almost an impossible challenge of how do you create a building there without destroying what I would say is one of the certainly the best memorials of the 20th century. At the same time, the client who was running this competition, the Vietnam Veterans Foundation, started to realize that the meaning of the wall was shifting as the age groups of people visiting the wall, sort of in high school, grade school and high school, and even college, started to have fewer and fewer connections to people whose names are on the wall. And so over the course of the competition, I was working on this and visited it probably 6 or 7 times. And the power is, even if you don't know someone there, you see someone else who knows someone there. They're rubbing the name on the wall, and the meaning that comes, and sort of the power of watching people interact with this element. And it was interesting because the competition, the memorial's right here. This is Constitution Gardens, Lincoln Memorial. The competition basically was open where you could cite it. There was a law basically said they could build this. It could be 10,000 square feet of public space. It had to be underground, which was basically had a basic conceptual flaw we can talk about, I would say. But one of the things they wanted to do is help come up with an idea for citing it, and in meeting with them, really understanding that the process is so difficult on having anything built on the mall, that the strategy of citing it is as important as the design itself. Yeah, all of you probably know the memorial, and of course the materiality and qualities of it. Its formal relationship to the monument and to the Lincoln Memorial and sort of the power that you have. The real fear that we had is that how do you make something that doesn't destroy the subtlety and strength of this? And also, at the same time, trying to support it and trying to create an education center so people can go to that without ruining their other experience, but understanding the need for this. We did a fair amount of analysis of the site and a fair amount of study models and different ways of engaging, just how do you engage the ground plane and how do you go underground. In looking at that, looked at a couple different sites, and really one became very prominent in our mind and seemed the right place to work. And in essence, was right, there's a berm right here off to one side of the memorial. And as we were starting to look at the views, we realized there's sort of one point right here that you start to get out of view of the memorial, that the trees start to block your view and the elevations start to change that. And as you pull around, you re-engage a view to the Washington Monument. And we felt pretty strongly that if we could find a sweet spot for the memorial right here, where you could not see it from, for the education center, where you couldn't see it from the memorial, that would be the perfect balance that would allow people to engage the memorial alone or engage the education center, but choose to ignore one if they wanted to. And so we felt that you could start to really treat the education center within the formal language of Constitution Gardens. Constitution Gardens was designed, I think, by David Childs in the early 70s. Sort of a faux, I don't know what to quite call it, honestly, but a very clear sort of formal language of curving paths and sort of exposed views that open up. And I think one of the strengths of the monument itself, besides the fact that the people become as much of a design object as anything else, is that it has a very clear difference in language to the gardens. And we felt that difference was important. So we thought, can we start to treat the education center really as a path, and only a path and continuation of the gardens? And can you start to engage, just as you come around the path, just come into the memorial? And so we really just treated it as a continuous path that brought you in and then just back out. Oh, another issue that we were dealing with is a sort of projected 2 to 3 million people coming into 10,000 square feet of either, which was 10,000 people a day. And so how do you deal with incredibly high numbers of people moving through a small space? And so by treating it as a path seemed like a way to engage the problem in an intelligent way that also started to align with a formal solution. So we treated it basically as a continuation of that path that was basically dropped underground. And really the entrance was just at the point that you would re-engage a view to the Washington Monument. You can see this will probably be the only oval building I ever designed. In some of these sort of formal languages of starting to engage the oval and really coming in, slipping underground, and the galleries themselves are really just simply a 1 in 20 ramp that brings you down, and then an inner ramp that brings you back out again. There were some advantages to this, that the program wasn't set, so that we were working with Ralph Applebaum, an exhibition designer, try to set the program and realization. Can you come up with a design strategy that will allow the program to evolve if we secured the competition? In this case, we realized because it's in essence underground that you can put a series of programs or secondary rooms that work off of it, that work off the logic of the entrance. You can see coming in and then dropping down. The one piece of program that they specified is they wanted a hall or an area for remembrance of the specific people on the wall, a sort of a way of making the names visible in other ways or more tangible. And as we worked on this, we really sort of always had alternate strategies of how can you engage this idea in different ways to see whether it test the idea to see whether it was flexible enough, both in terms of program and circulation. The one other aspect, we're also actually working with Arup on this. The other goal was to try to get the incision in the landscape so small that all the ducts and grills and doors and everything could be as minimal as possible. So you didn't detract from the memorial. So it had a whole underground ventilation system and a whole series of other things that were engaged. And we really treated it as this ramp that At this point, we actually pulled on Jamie Carpenter, a sort of artist slash engineer who deals with light, because we realized that conceptually there was a sort of major problem as the memorial was designed and built. One of the big controversies was that they were burying the history of the Vietnam War by sort of carving it underground, or it was called a gash at the time before it opened, and that the sort of metaphorical strength of putting this whole exhibition underground really had a problem. So we started to realize that if we could sort of leverage this idea and create a museum that works around ideas of light that could almost flip this conceptual problem and make it a strength. And so we basically saw a small oval incised in the top of the berm that brought light down in, and in basically 3 galleries, sort of exterior gallery, center gallery, and then a circulation space that brings you out. And in working with Jamie's office, doing a series of larger models to see how can you bring light down in. And it's not, what was important is it doesn't have to be bright enough to light a museum. It has to be bright enough to understand difference and change in the solar conditions. And so we did a series of larger models where we had one sort of what we call the outer light gallery that we felt it was important in terms of material, really to pull away any strong reading of material so it didn't compete with the memorial, and really have the objects themselves and the light be the material quality. This also tied in, as I said, the political context. As we were working on this, the Swift boat issue rose in John Kerry's campaign. So what went from a really simple competition went to a really dragged out fight between different aspects of our client, who in our presentation were literally yelling at each other over what the meaning of the Vietnam War was. It was an interesting experience, which probably don't want to repeat. But we felt by telling a story through objects themselves that you could basically pull away from any specific scripted history of what the war is, and I think there's a lot of parallels to a war we have now and sort of the meaning of that, through a space that's just a simple curving gallery with a translucent glass wall where you can see the motion of light along that wall, and it's just a slow path that brings you down. And see there's some different lighting conditions within that model. Or coming around further down, where you can start to see glimpses of people moving back up to the surface in their shadows. And then some renderings of showing different ways an exhibition could engage that space. The other aspect of light was really the inner gallery, sort of the names made visible space. In working with Ralph Appelbaum's office, we decided it would actually be more powerful to tell the stories of the individual people on the wall on their birthdays, basically on the day they were born. So there would always be a certain number of stories of the 52,000, some odd thousand people on the wall in a space that's just lit by just edge of light that moves across the space during the course of the day. Some of the models of that. Of course, the whole museum was designed to be handicapped accessible, sort of a fundamental aspect of who goes there and the number of people in wheelchairs. And different ways of playing out that in terms of the exhibition itself. And then finally, sort of the circulation drops down, and then you can walk in this interstitial skylight space to bring yourself back up to the ground, and really conceptually saying, can you create a space where there is no gallery, that is just about light and about returning to the surface. And the power of that is important. It's such a powerful subject that it's important to have a space where you just decompress and engage light in the landscape and as you move up to the surface. And back to the landscape above. And I am going to end here. As I said, at the beginning of this, as I was putting this together, we work on a pretty wide, maybe odd variety of projects in the office. Part of it, I think part of always the challenge in our office, we're around 15 people, are trying to keep, we're always trying to build larger and do the classic thing. And at the same time, there's certain size projects where ideas can exist in them, certain types of ideas. Other size projects where those ideas on a larger conceptual basis. For example, the competition, like this competition, can engage that we're not working on yet. So how do we balance an office that engages material and materiality and experience? How do you engage an office that deals with ideas of programming and use and experience? And then also, how do you engage an office that builds? Because the biggest learning and lesson for us always is building. That in the end, you need to test ideas, but the ultimate test is as you put them out there and people engage it, and you learn both good and bad what happens from that process. Thank you.
Small scale of a project like Princeton or the house in Martha's Vineyard with the kind of larger sort of global project that takes shape looking at warming and the impact of warming on New York. How do you begin to extend the expertise in your office through sort of collaborative work to be able to go between those two scales?
I think part of it's a learning process that we're still learning. So while facile might be the wrong word, but we're an office that's incredibly comfortable in terms of material and construction and detail at a smaller scale. And on these larger projects, even working in collaboration with GE, we've worked with for years, or this planning project that we're working at in Sayers, is understanding the process well enough to be able to know when you can engage ideas or when the process starts to steamroll over designing. So I'm still learning. The answer is I'm still figuring it out. I think we have it figured out on some of the projects, and other ones we haven't. What is clear is that the strategy of design ties, or in my mind, ties really clearly into the strategy of the design process. And you're always as much trying to design a strong process that supports what you're trying to do. And that small mistakes, in the same way that when you're designing a building and you make a small mistake and it ripples its way through the life of the project and you're dealing with it, those mistakes ripple through the process of designing. And trying to sort of set up I think it's working well. I mean, I don't think the design's there yet for the collaboration with GE on the waterfront, but trying to set up partnerships where ideas really can be shared and that you're carving out enough time to do that is really important. But I'll get back to you when I figured it out.
Yeah, I have a question. It's sort of related to that. What is the boundary between what you're doing, say, with the City of New York and what the Department of City and Regional Planning, with city planning and urban planners in New York? And is there sort of a public-private partnership? Because it seems like you've brought together a lot of expertise. Are you getting money from the city? And likewise, do you ever push back on some of the historic buildings as an architect as you're trying to make decisions? Do you ever say, well, I'm supposed to leave it in this way, but I would really like to change it for some design reason or for the client's reason? And are there negotiations with historic trust or with the planning department?
On the project, the Latrobe project very specifically, and I'll probably say this wrong and get in trouble, but I think when we're doing a planning project that's close there and we're dealing with every agency and every person we need to deal with. On the Latrobe project, it's important, and we've tried to pull in scientists who can help us understand best we can and work with us. However, we feel it's really important sometimes to have a purely conceptual project where we're not engaging that. So we're not dealing with the city on that project. And we're not dealing with the Army Corps of Engineers, who I've dealt with on other projects. And they're all great, but at certain points, sometimes it's good to do a purely speculative project that's based on certain ideas, even if the ideas are pushed beyond reason, because it helps reframe how people look at things. And that's how we see this project. Other times, I think it's actually really interesting on how do you work with government or historic structures within this. In this case, I grew up in Brooklyn. We're wiping out vast stretches of my neighborhoods where I grew up, and not always for the better, but I think it's important to try to sometimes frame ideas like that and allow yourself the ability to do that. I think the Tokyo Bay project is a good example of that we looked to in the past where that happened in the 60s. Just how it can completely reframe the scale and scope of a project. Something very ceremonial about the handing of the microphone. Better have a good question. Yeah. Well, some of it is going after grants. So the La Trobe is a grant-driven project. So that's a 2-year period, and you will either have it'll be intern-driven with different people in the office jumping onto it throughout the life of that. Honestly, it's just an art of trying to balance what scale and what we're interested in and the time we have, and knowing that sometimes successfully and sometimes not successfully, by the way. Of course, you don't show the really not successful things. So it's just trying to figure out whatever time we can balance, and if there's ideas that usually come up from early stages of projects. So the corrugated cardboard lamp, for example, came up from, we were asked to do an installation at MoMA where the funding for it dried up, but there was a 2-week study with of making an enormous corrugated cardboard wall that was very different, but it was like there's an interesting idea here, and at what point can we pull that idea and bring it up again to work on it? And so, and it's the same thing as you sort of try to harvest your ideas and try to pull them to life when you have the right resources for it, or the right collaborations, whether it's with Guy Norden's an instructional engineer or Scott Stoll, graphic designer. It's like, oh, here's a person who has much better ideas than I do, or thinks in a realm that I don't think about, that allows that to happen. We try to also set that up within the office of the balance of people in there. But again, like everything else, it sometimes works well and sometimes doesn't. So.
Stephen, on a related question again. What relationship does your teaching and practice, what relationships, I guess, do they have? Are you always teaching as you practice? And what do you hope to get out of it?
Adam and I often teach together, not always. We teach probably on an average every other year, every third semester. It's a balance. Again, it's the 3-point balance of having enough time in the office just to get our work done. The teaching is really important because it just forces you to articulate what you care about in ways that that you don't always have to do with clients, or you should do with clients, but you get out of the habit. And also just negotiation of, we have families and other that we want to see and do. So I would, if the day were longer, I'd teach more. But usually you can sort of feel now's the time to teach a studio, or the studio that I'm teaching now. Some of the ideas of program and a relationship of an institution to program that really came up on the Vietnam Memorial, to me, tie into the ideas of this gay and lesbian synagogue that we've been doing programming for, looking for a site in the last year. And so that's an interesting thing. I can't quite articulate what it is. Hopefully by the end of the studio, you guys will help me articulate what some of those issues are, and then you can start to grow those ideas further. So I think, again, there should be always a back and forth between them if you're good.
I had another question about research, because it seemed like many of the projects, the research that went into them didn't overtly appear in the product. So there's a kind of simplicity, an overt will towards simplicity that the projects portray or display. And so it made me think of your office a little differently than I had in the past, that if you drop out the R, you get architecture office, and there's a kind of generic quality to everything. Very refined, modernism. It was different in the first two projects where, with the lighting of the educational center or the fluid dynamics of the first one, there's explicitly a whole kind of research agenda there, and a portrayal of the project that research ultimately allows you to come up with solutions that you wouldn't otherwise have come up with. But I guess I'm interested in the other side that I saw and hadn't really thought much about before, which is very restrained, and almost suppressed in a certain way, that the research aspects of the project it's not like Sejima's Toledo Glass Museum, where you're just asking yourself at every moment, how did they do that? And why is it so beautiful?
I guess I see on a lot of the projects the research as a tool to understand a really deep context of a project. And so and maybe the Brown project, where a really deep understanding of either how an institution sees itself, how people use it, the formal qualities of how light comes into a site or place, the physical qualities of how people move through a place, and an understanding of the constructional technologies that are available within a budget, and that allows for, and I agree, allows for an understanding or generating a project that looks like that's what it should be. And so the research may be, and in some ways that's just what design is, but you try to do it enough that as you're using the building, it's not just an implementation of our design on that, but it's a really tighter weaving of the ideas of the building to the formal ideas of the building, to the material ideas, to supporting the building as really an extension of who's using it and why, an extension of what they want to achieve from it. And so to do that, you need to understand it well. And so sometimes the research is literally at that level, and it's like, okay, now I understand it, I can articulate it well enough to design through that problem. I don't know if that makes sense as an answer, but and other times it's an overt research project. I can't quite tell you why, when, or the other.
Yeah, I have a question that picks up with that a little bit in terms of its question about generality. Interested in the way you collaborate with structural engineers, graphic designers. We're used to hearing that architects can learn from them and that architects are the generalists who kind of coordinate the team effort. What would you say someone like Guy Nordenson is learning from your practice? What are the graphic designers learning from you explicitly?
You have to ask them. No.
I mean, I know it's an unfair question. I'm just wondering if you've seen any impact, if there's been a kind of ripple effect in their work.
I mean, I can think of an impact with Guy because I've worked with him for so long, and I worked when I was at Stephen Hall's. I worked with him, so like from 1986, I've known Guy. It's like straight out of college, basically. I think that, and again, you can ask Guy about this, there is a methodology in terms of which some I showed and some I didn't, in terms of how we approach and study a problem through an iterative method of trying to come up with either a formal solution that is both strengthening the conceptual solution or a formal solution that's strengthening the material idea. So Guy is doing a series of pedestrian bridges in New York City for the Department of Transportation, and he has he's doing one at Yale, really beautiful, almost corrugated sides that are laser cut steel, that is the structure. And an understanding of when the integration of how that bridge hits the side, of understanding of how certain ideas can actually undermine the overall idea unless it's resolved. So sometimes a lot of the things that we try to do is actually get stuff out of the way so the initial ideas or use can come through. And we spend a lot of time like trying to make stuff disappear in order to not have static. So I know certainly that would be from Guy. You know, someone like Scott Stoll, he's probably learned that he's happy he's a graphic designer and not an architect because it happens so much faster. He's always just rolling his eyes saying it's such a ridiculous process that we go through, where he'll work through 10 projects between the time I call him the next, oh, we should work on this, and I'll say, that's still under construction, that other project we talked about? I can't believe that. So maybe that's the realization that Scott has.
Okay, please join us downstairs for the exhibition reception. If you have other questions, you can ask them personally to Stephen. Thank you.